Sarah glanced nervously at her husband, Mark, who sat beside her in the waiting room of the hospital's pediatric wing. Their 6-year-old son, Jake, swung his legs back and forth, oblivious to his mother's anxiety. "He's fine, Sarah," Mark said, his voice calm but tinged with mild exasperation. "It's just a cold. We didn't have to come all the way here for this." Sarah sighed, clutching Jake's hand. "I just want to be sure. What if it's something serious?" Mark opened his mouth to reply, but at that moment, the door to the examination area swung open, and a young doctor stepped out. He was tall and striking, with dark, neatly combed hair and a warm, confident smile that instantly put people at ease. "Jake Walters?" he called, scanning the room. Sarah stood, her heart skipping a beat as her eyes met his. "That's us." The doctor extended his hand. "I'm Dr. Ethan Reynolds. Let's take a look at Jake and see what's going on." Jake trotted after him, clutching his mother's hand, while Mark followed at a measured pace. Inside the examination room, Dr. Reynolds made quick work of assessing Jake's symptoms. He listened to Sarah's concerns with a patience and attentiveness that felt rare. "His lungs sound clear, and there's no fever now," Dr. Reynolds said, smiling at Jake, who beamed back. "It's likely just a mild viral infection. Rest and fluids should do the trick. But let me know if anything changes." Sarah exhaled deeply, relief washing over her. "Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. Call me Ethan," he said with a friendly smile. "And you're doing a great job keeping an eye on him. Kids bounce back quickly." Sarah felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "Thanks. It's just, I worry about him a lot." "That's what good parents do," Ethan said. His gaze lingered on Sarah for a moment longer than necessary before he turned back to Jake. "And you, young man, are going to be just fine." On the drive home, Sarah couldn't stop replaying the interaction in her mind. She told herself she was simply grateful for Ethan's kindness and professionalism, but something about him had left her feeling unsettled in a way she couldn't quite explain. "See?" Mark said, breaking the silence. "Just a cold. Nothing to stress over." Sarah nodded, forcing a smile. "I know. It's good to be sure." Mark shrugged, his attention already shifting to the evening ahead. But Sarah's mind remained fixed on Ethan's warm smile, and the way his voice had softened when he spoke to her. The days passed uneventfully, but Sarah found herself thinking about the visit more often than she cared to admit. She Googled Ethan's name, curious about his credentials and background. She discovered he was in his early 30s, a rising star in pediatrics, and had recently been featured in an article about young doctors making a difference. "Impressive," she murmured, scrolling through the article. A picture of Ethan accompanied the piece, his easy smile and confident posture making her stomach flutter. A week later, Jake's mild cold lingered, with a persistent cough that made Sarah uneasy. Though Mark insisted it was nothing, Sarah decided to book a follow-up appointment. "You really don't have to go," Mark said as she prepared to take Jake back to the hospital. "It's just a precaution," she said, brushing him off. When Sarah and Jake arrived at the hospital, her heart raced as they approached the reception desk. "We're here for a follow-up with Dr. Reynolds," she said, her voice betraying her excitement. Ethan greeted them with the same warmth as before, his presence somehow even more magnetic this time. During the appointment, Sarah found herself sharing more about Jake's habits, asking questions that weren't entirely relevant to his cough. Ethan answered every one with genuine interest, and their conversation soon shifted to lighter topics. "Parenting is a full-time job, isn't it?" Ethan said, leaning back in his chair. "It definitely keeps us on our toes," Sarah replied with a laugh. "But it's worth it. You seem like a natural," he said, his tone sincere. "Jake's lucky to have you." Sarah's cheeks flushed again. "Thank you. That means a lot." That night, as Sarah lay in bed, her thoughts wandered to Ethan once more. She told herself it was harmless, just a passing admiration for a kind and capable doctor. But deep down, she knew there was something more, a spark she hadn't felt in years. She glanced over at Mark, who was already snoring softly, and wondered if he would ever notice the change stirring within her. The seed had been planted, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with Ethan was only the beginning. Sarah couldn't deny the thrill she felt every time she thought about Dr. Ethan Reynolds. She tried to convince herself it was nothing more than harmless admiration, but the thought of him lingered in her mind longer than it should. It was a spark she hadn't felt in years, not since before life became a blur of responsibilities, routines, and the slow erosion of excitement in her marriage. Jake's mild cough persisted, though it wasn't alarming. Still, Sarah seized the opportunity to schedule another follow-up appointment. Mark raised an eyebrow when she mentioned it over breakfast. "Didn't Ethan say it was just a viral thing?" Mark asked, sipping his coffee. "Dr. Reynolds," Sarah corrected reflexively. "And yes, but I just want to make sure nothing's been overlooked." Mark shrugged. "If it makes you feel better. I've got a meeting today, so I can't come with you." "That's fine," Sarah said, hiding her relief. At the hospital, Sarah felt a flutter of excitement as she approached the reception desk. "We're here to see Dr. Reynolds," she said, trying to sound casual. Ethan appeared moments later, his easy smile making her heart race. "Jake! How's my favorite patient doing?" he asked, crouching to Jake's level. Jake grinned. "I'm okay. My cough's not bad." Ethan ruffled Jake's hair and gestured for them to follow him into the exam room. Once inside, Ethan's attention turned to Sarah. "How have you been?" he asked, his tone warm. "Good," Sarah replied quickly, feeling her cheeks heat up. "Busy, but that's just life." "I hear you," Ethan said, nodding. "Sometimes it feels like there's never enough time to catch your breath." They talked as he examined Jake, their conversation flowing with surprising ease. Ethan shared a story about his own childhood, and Sarah laughed more freely than she had in months. When he assured her again that Jake's symptoms were improving and nothing serious, Sarah felt a pang of disappointment. She didn't want the appointment to end. Back at home, Sarah found herself replaying their conversation. Ethan's smile, the way he'd remembered little details about Jake, even his subtle jokes, everything about him seemed perfect. She knew it was wrong to feel this way, but she couldn't stop herself. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen and valued. That night, as Sarah tucked Jake into bed, her phone buzzed on the nightstand. She glanced at it, her breath catching when she saw the sender's name, Dr. Ethan Reynolds. "Ethan, just wanted to check in and make sure Jake is still doing well. You're a great mom, Sarah. He's lucky to have you." Sarah stared at the message, her heart pounding. She knew she should ignore it, or at least keep her response brief. But the warmth in his words made her feel something she hadn't felt in years, appreciated. "Sarah, thanks Ethan. He's doing much better. I appreciate all your help." She hesitated, then added, "Sarah, and the kind words." Ethan's reply came quickly. "Ethan, anytime. If you ever need anything, even just someone to talk to, I'm here." Sarah stared at the screen, a battle waging inside her. She knew this was crossing a line, but she couldn't help herself. "Sarah, that means a lot." "Thank you." The following week, Sarah found herself making excuses to text Ethan. She asked questions about Jake's diet, advice on over-the-counter remedies, anything to keep the conversation going. Ethan always responded promptly, his messages filled with reassurance and charm. Each exchange left Sarah wanting more. Mark began to notice the change in her. "You've been on your phone a lot lately," he remarked one evening as they watched TV. "Work stuff?" Yeah," Sarah said quickly, locking her phone and setting it aside. "Just some emails." Mark didn't press further, but his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than usual. A few days later, Sarah decided to stop by the hospital under the pretense of clarifying a question about Jake's treatment plan. She didn't call ahead, wanting the element of surprise. When she arrived, Ethan greeted her warmly. "Sarah, what a nice surprise," he said, his smile widening. "Everything okay with Jake?" "Oh, yes, he's doing great," Sarah said quickly. I had a question about his diet. I figured it'd be better to ask in person. Ethan chuckled. Always thorough. I like that. They stepped into his office, and for a moment, the atmosphere shifted. The conversation started with Jake but soon veered into personal territory. Ethan asked about her life, her interests, and Sarah found herself opening up in a way she hadn't with Mark in years. She shared her frustrations about balancing motherhood and her marriage, and Ethan listened intently, his gaze never wavering. You're incredible, Sarah, he said softly. You do so much for everyone else. Don't forget to take care of yourself too. His words sent a jolt through her. Before she could think, Ethan reached out and lightly touched her hand. Sarah's breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. The moment lingered, charged with unspoken tension, before she finally stood, breaking the spell. I should go, she said, her voice shaky. Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. Take care, Sarah. On the drive home, Sarah's mind raced. She knew she was on dangerous ground, but a part of her didn't care. For the first time in years, she felt alive. And that feeling was becoming impossible to resist. Sarah knew she was spiraling, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. Her conversations with Ethan had become a daily occurrence, their texts veering further from Jake's health and deeper into personal, intimate territory. Every message from him made her heart race, and every stolen moment of interaction felt like a secret only they shared. One afternoon, Ethan texted her. Ethan, I have a break in my schedule later today. Want to stop by for coffee? We could talk more about Jake, or anything else. Sarah hesitated, staring at the screen. She knew what this invitation meant, even if it wasn't stated outright. Her fingers hovered over her phone for a long moment before she typed back. Sarah, sure. I'll be there. When Sarah arrived at the hospital that afternoon, her palms were damp, her nerves frayed. She told Mark she was running errands, a half-truth that left a bitter taste in her mouth. But the pull toward Ethan was stronger than her guilt. Ethan greeted her at the hospital's side entrance, dressed in his usual scrubs but with an air of casual ease that made Sarah's chest tighten. I'm glad you came, he said, his smile warm. I almost didn't, Sarah admitted, her voice shaky. Ethan led her to a small break room, where they sat at a table tucked away in the corner. A pair of coffee mugs sat between them, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Their conversation started innocently enough, but as the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere grew heavier. Ethan leaned closer, his voice soft. You're different, Sarah. I can't stop thinking about you. Sarah's breath caught. She wanted to deny it, to push him away, but the truth was, she felt the same. She had been thinking about him constantly, replaying their moments together over and over. This is wrong, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Then why does it feel so right? Ethan replied, his hand brushing hers. The touch sent a jolt through Sarah. She looked at him, her resolve crumbling. Before she could think, his lips were on hers, soft but insistent. She didn't pull away. That kiss in the break room was the beginning of the affair. Sarah and Ethan's encounters became more frequent, more secretive. They met in quiet corners of the hospital, at a secluded coffee shop on the outskirts of town, and eventually, at a nearby motel where they could be alone without fear of discovery. Each time, Sarah promised herself it would be the last. But each time, she found herself going back, unable to resist the magnetic pull of Ethan's charm. He made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years, and for a while, that was enough to drown out her guilt. At home, Mark began to notice the changes in Sarah. She was dressing differently, paying more attention to her appearance. She'd grown more distant, her phone never far from her hand. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Mark decided to bring it up. Is everything okay with you? He asked, his tone cautious. You've been different lately. Sarah forced a smile. I'm fine. Just stressed, I guess. Work, Jake, everything. Mark studied her for a moment, his brow furrowed. If something's wrong, you can tell me. You know that, right? I know, Sarah said quickly, avoiding his gaze. I'm fine. Really. But Mark wasn't convinced. Later that night, after Sarah had fallen asleep, he picked up her phone from the nightstand. It was locked, but he'd seen her enter the code before. His heart raced as he scrolled through her messages, looking for anything out of the ordinary. What he found made his blood run cold. The messages between Sarah and Ethan were vague but suggestive, filled with inside jokes and compliments that felt far too personal. One message stood out. Ethan, can't wait to see you again. Yesterday was incredible. Mark put the phone down, his hands shaking. He didn't want to believe what he was seeing, but the evidence was undeniable. Sarah was hiding something, and it involved another man. The next day, Sarah met Ethan at their usual motel. She was already racked with guilt, but as soon as Ethan kissed her, the world outside faded away. For a few stolen hours, it was just the two of them, no responsibilities, no consequences. As they lay tangled in the sheets, Ethan traced lazy circles on her arm. You make me happier than I've been in a long time, he said. Sarah smiled, but her chest tightened. This can't last forever, Ethan. He frowned, propping himself up on one elbow. Why not? We're great together. We can figure it out. I have a family, Sarah said, her voice trembling. A husband. A son. I can't just walk away from that. Do you love him? Ethan asked, his gaze intense. Sarah hesitated. The truth was complicated, and she wasn't sure she had an answer. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know. Ethan reached for her hand, his expression softening. You deserve to be happy, Sarah. Don't forget that. But the cracks in their secret world were beginning to show. Back at home, Mark couldn't shake what he'd seen on Sarah's phone. He started paying closer attention to her behavior, noting every late-night text, every unexplained errand. His suspicions grew with each passing day, and he began to consider taking drastic measures to uncover the truth. Sarah, meanwhile, was torn between the life she'd built and the intoxicating pull of her affair. She knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. Sarah woke up in a haze, the weight of guilt pressing heavily on her chest. She glanced at the clock and realized it was already late morning. Mark had taken Jake to soccer practice, leaving her alone in the house. The silence felt oppressive, amplifying the turmoil in her mind. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Ethan. Ethan, I can't stop thinking about last night. You're incredible. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She wanted to reply, to tell him she felt the same, but the sound of the front door opening downstairs jolted her. Mark's voice called out. We're back! Jake forgot his water bottle. Panic surged through her. She locked her phone and shoved it under the pillow, forcing a smile as she walked downstairs. Mark was in the kitchen, filling the water bottle while Jake rummaged through his soccer bag. Everything okay? Mark asked, glancing at her. His tone was casual, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of suspicion. Yeah, just tired, Sarah said, avoiding his gaze. Did Jake have fun? Always, Mark replied, handing the water bottle to Jake. We're heading back now. You should rest. Sarah nodded, relief washing over her as they left. But the reprieve was short-lived. She knew Mark was growing suspicious. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. The way he watched her a little too closely, his questions about her day, the quiet tension that seemed to hang between them. That afternoon, Sarah met Ethan at their usual motel. She'd promised herself it was the last time, but as soon as she saw him, her resolve crumbled. They fell into each other's arms, their passion a temporary escape from the chaos of her life. You're my safe place, Sarah whispered as they lay entwined in bed. Ethan brushed a strand of hair from her face, his expression soft. And you're mine. But the reality of their situation was closing in. As Sarah dressed to leave, Ethan's phone buzzed on the nightstand. She glanced at the screen and froze. The name, Lauren, flashed across the display. "Who's Lauren?" she asked, her voice sharp. Ethan hesitated, his easy demeanor faltering. "My fiancé." Sarah's stomach dropped. "You have a fiancé?" "It's complicated," Ethan said, sitting up. "We've been on and off for years. It's not serious anymore." "Not serious?" Sarah repeated, her voice rising. "You're engaged, Ethan. And you're married," he shot back, his tone defensive. "We're both in complicated situations. That doesn't change how I feel about you." Sarah stared at him, a mix of anger and hurt swirling inside her. She grabbed her bag and stormed out, her mind racing. She'd known their affair was wrong, but this revelation made it feel even more sordid. Back at home, Sarah tried to act normal, but Mark's questions grew more pointed. "Where were you today?" he asked over dinner, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Just running errands," Sarah said, keeping her voice steady. Mark nodded but didn't press further. Later that night, as Sarah slept, he took her phone again, scrolling through her messages. This time, he screenshotted the incriminating texts and sent them to his own email. He didn't confront her yet. He needed more. The next day, Mark called a private investigator. He felt sick to his stomach taking such a step, but he couldn't ignore the nagging suspicion that Sarah was hiding something. He needed the truth, no matter how painful. The investigator's report came back within a week. It was worse than Mark had feared. Photos of Sarah and Ethan meeting at the motel, timestamps that coincided with her errands, and even a record of their texts. Mark stared at the evidence, his hands trembling. The confrontation came that evening. Mark waited until Jake was asleep before pulling Sarah into the living room. He laid the photos and texts on the coffee table, his expression hard. "Care to explain this?" he asked, his voice low and icy. Sarah's eyes widened as she looked at the evidence. Her throat went dry. "Mark, I can explain." "Don't," Mark snapped. "I've seen enough." "How long has this been going on?" Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "A few months," she admitted. Mark's jaw tightened. "Do you love him?" "No," Sarah said quickly. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" Mark demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you threw away our marriage for some thrill." Sarah broke down, sobbing. "I don't know why I did it. I've been so unhappy, and Ethan, he made me feel something I haven't felt in years." "So instead of talking to me, you ran to him?" Mark's voice cracked with anger and hurt. "Do you have any idea what this will do to Jake? To us?" "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered. "I'll do anything to fix this." But Mark wasn't sure if their marriage could be repaired. The betrayal ran too deep, and the wounds were fresh. He left that night, driving aimlessly to clear his head, leaving Sarah alone with her guilt. As the days passed, the fallout grew worse. Lauren, Ethan's fiancée, discovered the affair and confronted Sarah at the hospital during one of her visits. The scene was explosive, with Lauren accusing Sarah of destroying her relationship. The confrontation was loud enough to draw the attention of hospital staff, leaving Sarah humiliated. Mark, meanwhile, began meeting with a lawyer to discuss his options. He couldn't bear the thought of losing Jake, but he also couldn't imagine staying in a marriage built on lies. Sarah's world was unraveling, and she was powerless to stop it. The life she'd built was crumbling, and for the first time, she realized just how much she stood to lose. The days following the confrontation felt like a surreal nightmare for Sarah. Mark had moved into the guest bedroom, a silent but clear declaration of his distance. Jake, blissfully unaware of the tension, went about his days, but Sarah could feel Mark's icy presence in every corner of the house. Her once comfortable home now felt like a battlefield littered with invisible landmines. Mark's absence at dinner and his refusal to engage in any conversation beyond the bare minimum were a constant reminder of the damage she'd done. Sarah's guilt consumed her, but she wasn't sure how to begin repairing what was broken, or if it was even possible. Ethan's texts continued, but Sarah ignored them. After the explosive confrontation with his fiancée, Lauren, at the hospital, The affair felt tainted in a way it hadn't before. She couldn't stomach the thought of speaking to Ethan, let alone seeing him again. For all his charm and the thrill he'd brought into her life, Ethan had ultimately been the match that lit the fuse to her imploding world. One evening, Ethan showed up unannounced at her house. Sarah was in the kitchen when she heard the knock. Her heart sank as she peeked out the window to see him standing on the porch. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, opening the door just enough to speak to him. "I needed to see you," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "I've been going crazy not hearing from you. Can we talk?" Sarah glanced back nervously, but Mark and Jake were out at the park. She stepped outside, closing the door behind her. "There's nothing to talk about," she said firmly. "This is over, Ethan. It should have never happened." Ethan's expression darkened. "You don't mean that. I know what we had was real. It was a mistake," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "I'm trying to fix my marriage, my family. Please don't make this harder than it already is." Ethan stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You can't just shut me out, Sarah. I care about you." Before Sarah could respond, Mark's car pulled into the driveway. Her stomach dropped as she watched him get out, Jake in tow. Mark froze when he saw Ethan, his face hardening with realization. "What the hell is this?" Mark demanded, his voice low but seething with anger. "Mark, please," Sarah began, stepping between them. "He was just leaving." But Mark ignored her, his focus locked on Ethan. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here. Get off my property before I call the police." Ethan raised his hands defensively, taking a step back. "I'm leaving," he said, glancing at Sarah one last time before walking away. Mark turned to Sarah, his eyes blazing. "This is who you've been sneaking around with? Bringing him here to our house?" "I didn't invite him," Sarah said desperately. "I told him it's over. I swear." Mark shook his head, his expression filled with disgust. "You've destroyed everything, Sarah. I hope it was worth it." The confrontation was the breaking point. Mark filed for separation the following week, stating he needed time to decide what was best for him and Jake. Sarah begged him to reconsider, but his mind was made up. "I can't trust you anymore," Mark said during one of their final conversations. "And without trust, there's nothing left." Sarah's days became a blur of regret and loneliness. She threw herself into being a mother to Jake, determined to shield him from the fallout of her mistakes. But even Jake began to sense the tension. One evening he asked, "Why doesn't Daddy sleep in your room anymore?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Daddy and I are just taking some time to think about things, sweetheart. But we both love you very much." Jake nodded solemnly, but the sadness in his eyes was unmistakable. Meanwhile, Ethan's life was also unraveling. Lauren's family had filed a formal complaint against him with the hospital, citing his unethical behavior. He was placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. The scandal spread quickly among his colleagues, tarnishing the pristine reputation he'd once held. Ethan called Sarah one last time, but she didn't answer. She couldn't. Whatever they'd shared was over, and she had no intention of looking back. Months passed, and Sarah's life settled into a new, uneasy normal. She and Mark communicated only about Jake, their conversations polite but devoid of warmth. The love that had once defined their marriage felt like a distant memory. One evening, as Sarah tucked Jake into bed, he looked up at her and said, "I hope you and Daddy stop being mad at each other." Sarah's heart broke. She kissed his forehead, whispering, "Me too, baby. Me too." The story ended without clear resolution, the wounds too fresh to heal fully. Mark and Sarah remained separated, both unsure if their marriage could survive the betrayal. Ethan faded into the background, a reminder of choices that couldn't be undone. Life moved on, but the scars remained, a testament to the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of crossing lines that should never have been crossed.